The United States has suspended bilateral talks with Russia on the Syrian peace process. Washington has denounced Russian efforts in fighting ISIL, claiming that not very much progress has been achieved.
What we have seen from the Russians in the year or so since their military intervention in Syria is that they have not made much progress against ISIL. They claim that the reason that they're in Russia or in Syria is to fight extremists, but they haven't achieved a significant counter-ISIL objective in more than 7 months, and they've been reduced to trying to claim credit for successful U.S. operations.
Well, the White House never mentioning the Russian contribution, of course, to the liberation of that ancient city of Palmyra from ISIL, or, for example, targeting the miles and miles of convoys of terrorists' oil in their trucks going up north over the border. We asked U.S. officials whether they actually believe the U.S. is truly fulfilling its promises made on Syria.
The State Department says Russia failed to live up to its commitments and was, quote, either unable or unwilling to ensure Syrian regime adherence to the arrangements to which Moscow agreed. Rather, the statement says, Russia and the Syrian regime have chosen to pursue a military course. I asked the State Department if the U.S. lived up to its own obligations under the deal.
You said Russia did not live up to its obligations under the deal. Did the U.S. fully live up to its obligations?
We believe we did.
Did the U.S. separate the rebels from terrorists as it said it would?
As we talked about last week, the United States continued to have detailed, ongoing discussions with members of the opposition, emphasizing our view on the importance of demobilizing, of pulling part from Nusra.
Under the deal, it was incumbent on the U.S. to get leading rebel groups to abide by the ceasefire and to separate them from al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda in Syria. However, from day one of the agreement, Syria's second largest rebel group, al-Sham, came out and said that they would not abide by it, that they would not separate themselves from al-Nusra in Aleppo. To my question whether the U.S. expected a unilateral ceasefire on the part of Russia and the Syrian army, there was no clear answer at the State Department. It is also not clear if the U.S. now has its own plan of fighting al-Nusra in Aleppo, or whether Washington now just left it to Russia. For many months, the U.S. hadn't really targeted that group, even though it is al-Qaeda. Here's what the State Department said last week on that.
You hit Nusra, I believe you described it as al-Qaeda maybe in March or something, or February. It was earlier this year.
Yep.
Since then, there hasn't been any specific action against Nusra, is that right? Military action?
No, but I'd have to double check. I just can't definitively say that. As they became intermingled, and as they became intermingled in civilian areas, we've always sought to limit the possibility of civilian casualties.
Since the beginning of its operation in Syria, Russia has focused not only on ISIL, but also on al-Nusra. But in parts of Syria, al-Nusra teamed up with rebel groups that Washington considers legitimate Syrian opposition, and as a result, the U.S. had been reluctant to target them.
Russia's envoy to the UN says there is no alternative to U.S.-Russia cooperation when seeking a peaceful resolution of the Syrian conflict. At a media conference in New York, Vitaly Churkin faced some tough questions about Russia's campaign in Aleppo.
How do you then explain the fact that your country is carrying out an indiscriminate bombardment along with its Syrian allies, killing civilians, women and children in eastern Aleppo in defiance of international humanitarian law?
Well, first of all, of course, I cannot subscribe to the less than elegant phrasing of your question. I understand where you are coming from. Well, had it not been for our involvement in Syria, it might well be that the black flags would be flying over Damascus. It could well be. Our military are trying to choose their targets very carefully. Eastern Aleppo has been taken hostage by Nusra and some others who are working with Nusra. Please give us a recipe how to deal about it. Sometimes we heard from the United States that one of the problems was that their targeting methods were much more sophisticated than others. So they were alleging that they're in a better position. They were in a better position to avoid civilian casualties. So we're saying, fine. In that case, this is another incentive for us to get together to make sure that our actions do not cause any civilian casualties. Unfortunately, it didn't work out from the perspective of the United States.
Well, in the meantime, the U.S. strategy in Syria hasn't been changed much over the years of conflict. It's still a case of battling Assad while saying it's battling ISIL. Caleb Mopan reports.
When describing the Syrian conflict, which has been raging for 5 years at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives, the U.S. has always narrowed the problem down to one man.
In Syria, the only way that the civil war will end is an inclusive political transition to a new government without Bashar Assad.
Assad has to go.
It's time for Assad to get out of the way.
It is time for Bashar to go.
But Assad hasn't gone. In fact, the majority voted for him in the last election. But despite his popularity, the U.S. continues to fund opposition rebels while insisting that there is only one reason Assad is still in power.
Russia states an intent to fight ISIL on the one hand and to support Bashar al-Assad and his regime on the other. That approach is tantamount, as I said then, to pouring gasoline on the fire.
An attempt by Russia and Iran to prop up Assad and try to pacify the population is just going to get them stuck in a quagmire. And it won't work.
They keep pressing for that outcome and supporting the terrorists as leverage for that outcome. How can there be a diplomatic solution then if that's the only solution that Washington is willing to accept?
However, you may remember the times when it seemed like the U.S. was trying to get on the same page with Russia.
And I want to thank President Putin for his willingness to pick up on the possibility of negotiating an end to Syrian weapons of mass destruction.
We are engaged in an effort with all of the members of the International Syria Support Group and with Russia particularly in an effort to restore that cessation of hostilities in those places where it has been most at risk or most shredded.
U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry for you, so friendly in public. He sang a very different tune, though, when he thought he could actually speak his mind out of the sight of TV cameras.
I've argued for the use of force. I stood up. I'm the guy who stood up and announced we're going to attack Assad because of the weapons. And then, you know, things evolved into a different process.
Now cooperation is suspended. All options are on the table, again, and the mysterious Plan B has vanished.
I'd like to understand what Plan B is. Just explain to us the elements of Plan B.
Two things, Mr. Chairman. Russia's actions. This is going, of course, to be bad for everyone, but it's going to be bad first and foremost.
I want to hear about Plan B.
Well,
I understand all the context here.
I think, sir, this is important because Russia against Russia, Assad.
Give me the elements of Plan B.
So two things. Again, the consequences, Russia, the regime, Russia's actions.
Let me just say what we already know. There is no Plan B.
Well, I think that's been the case all along, that there's never really been a Plan B. No one in the Obama administration really believes that there's any major new undertaking that the administration could try that would really change the reality there.
The ceasefire is over, but the grandstanding and geopolitical maneuvers continue. Meanwhile, ISIL and al-Nusra are getting stronger, and the Syrian people keep suffering. Caleb Mopan, RT, New York.